There's always a light that I'm like, which one? Hey, whoa, look at that. Doing things. All right. Remind me. Do you guys know? Did we talk about the ontological argument at all last week?
No, we did not.
Because I thought
we should, and then I can refute.
I thought about showing you guys. I wanted to show it, but I couldn't remember if we ended up looking at that last. So we're into now the arguments for. Yeah, you can go ahead and hit it. So just as a quick review, we've talked now about how we know that God exists or how we know truth exists. Now we're looking at the reasons why we know God exists. And there's a few different arguments that we're going to talk about with that. Last week, we talked about the cosmological argument, which is basically just saying that we know that the universe had a beginning. If the universe has a beginning, it needs to have something that began it. And if that's true, then whatever began it has to be greater than the thing itself. And that's just how we understand causes and how they work. And so with that in mind, we understood that a thing needs to be beyond space, time, and matter, and it needs to be personal and powerful. And so that all points to God in some sort of way. And then today we're going to talk about some of the other arguments. We're going to briefly talk about the ontological argument, which is one of the philosophical proofs of the existence of God. And then we're going to talk more into the design argument, which is mainly and really best argued, I think, through looking at astronomy. Because a lot of people, when we talk about design, looking at evolution or looking at just design within biology and stuff like that, people will try to justify that as being figured out through evolution. It's harder to give an explanation of that with astronomy. And so we'll focus more on that this week as far as how the design best prove that sort of thing. But first, because I'm seeing that I think there is some legitimacy to the ontological argument, which is basically, if you guys remember last week, we talked about all of the different arguments. Basically, we'll look at in some way looking at the universe, and from that produce an argument to say that God must exist. The ontological argument is going to be different. Before I even know the universe, philosophically, I can make an argument for the existence of God. And so it doesn't require any understanding of the known universe whatsoever. It just uses reason itself to kind of make that argument. So we're going to watch again, like I talked about, a lot of the videos that we'll watch just kind of give an argument for the existence of God really simply in some of these videos from William Lane Craig. And so this is one of those videos, and this is his explanation of the ontological argument.
In the year 1078, a monk named Anselm of Canterbury astonished the world by arguing that if it is even possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God does exist. Anselm's argument came to be called the ontological argument, and it has sharply divided philosophers ever since. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer called it a charming joke, but many prominent 20th century philosophers, such as Charles Hartshorne, Norman Malcolm, and Alvin Plantinga, think that it's sound. Here it is. God can be defined as a maximally great being. If something were greater than God, then that being would be God. And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect in every possible world. Possible worlds are simply ways the world could have been. To say that something exists in a possible world is just to say that if the world were that way, then the thing would have existed. For example, even though unicorns don't exist in the actual world, it seems at least possible that they could have. So we can say that unicorns exist in some possible world. On the other hand, a married bachelor does not exist in the world because the idea of a married bachelor is logically incoherent. It could not possibly exist. So if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then we can say that he exists in some possible world. But wait, a maximally great being would not really be maximally great if it existed in only some possible worlds. To be maximally great, it has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. So think about it. If a maximally great being exists in any possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if it exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. That is, a maximally great being actually exists. Thus, the atheist has to maintain not simply that God does not exist, but that it is impossible that God exists. Here's a summary of the ontological argument. Steps 2 through 6 are straightforward and largely uncontroversial. But what about point number 1? Clearly, if it can be shown that the idea of a God is logically incoherent, then the argument fails. But is the idea of a maximally great being absurd, like a married bachelor, or a square circle, or the smell of blue? This doesn't seem to be the case. The notion of the all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being that exists in every possible world seems to be a perfectly coherent idea. But couldn't we parody this argument and make it work for anything? Why not say, it's logically possible that a maximally great pizza exists. Therefore, a maximally great pizza does exist? However, the idea of a maximally great pizza is not like the idea of a maximally great being. In the first place, there aren't intrinsic maximal values that make pizzas great. There could always be one more pepperoni to increase its greatness. It's not even obvious what properties make a pizza great. Thin crust or thick crust, extra cheese, anchovies. It's relative to the taste of the consumer. In the second place, a maximally great pizza would have to exist in every logical possible world. But that would mean that it couldn't be eaten. So it wouldn't be something you can eat. The idea, on the other hand, is an intuitively coherent idea. Therefore, his existence is a possibility. And the ontological argument shows that if God possibly exists, then God actually exists.
All right. So that's a very brief explanation. This isn't, like I said, we're talking about a lot of the different arguments that we use for the existence of God. This isn't one that I would generally recommend people to use. He has generally the philosophical notions that this needs to kind of work properly. Most people aren't going to understand, both as the person that's probably proposing this argument and the people that you're debating with. And so it's not that I necessarily find this argument unconvincing. I actually think there's some pretty good reasons for this. I think somebody who maybe is a philosopher might actually find this very, very intriguing and convincing. But most of the people that we're going to interact with just aren't going to really grasp all of the ideas in this. So before we move on, though, I just want to see any thoughts or questions that you guys have just about this, because it is a little outside of the box. If you got something, go for
Well, that
it.
would take us.
What?
I have some qualms of maximally great being theology.
Okay.
But I'm not sure if you want to talk about that. So we take a minute.
All right. We'll talk about it afterwards then.
I don't follow why you couldn't have a maximally great pizza.
Partly because,
I
well,
mean, even if you don't know what qualities define it, couldn't you still know it's a thing?
Well, like a definition of a pizza, it must be continued. Like his last way, like has to stop existing. But if you're saying that a maximally great pizza has to exist in every possible world, that means it can't stop existing. But by being a pizza, it must be able to stop existing. What?
Couldn't it be an infinite pizza?
If it was an infinitely big pizza?
I mean, couldn't it be a pizza that replicates itself or something else?
But
I mean,
the point of a
maximally great
pizza is it has
pizzas,
to-
I have opinion, would replicate.
They're pretty cool pizza. But the point of the pizza would
It'd
be
be
that in
maximally
order for it to be pizza, it has to be existing. That's what's
needs to be able to be consumed.
Yeah, but it could be consumed.
But if you've got an infinite number of people to eat your infinite pizza, then you have actual infinity problems first of all, because of pizza. Actual infinities are weird. But then you're actually
Right.
infinite number of people because you're actually infinite pizza.
We haven't actually found the possible world.
Actually exist. But like no, possible worlds are yeah. They're the
That doesn't even make sense to say.
Okay.
unless you're putting the
Yeah.
animals actually something with people. Anyway, yeah.
Cool. All right. So if you're interested more, that's definitely something to explore. But like I said, today, what I want to focus more on is the teleological argument. So last week we talked about the cosmological argument, looking at everything that has a beginning has to have something that began it. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe must have something that began it. And we made sure that we understood we're not saying that everything has to have something that created it. It's only the things that had a start that need to have something that created it. So when the atheist says, well, who created God? And in the whole argument, there's no theologian that you'll look at who gives an argument of God using a cosmological argument who says everything must have something that began it. They're saying everything that had a beginning must have something that began it. So the teleological argument is basically saying that everything that has a design must have a designer. The universe has a highly complex design, therefore the universe must have a designer. So quite simply, you could think of if you came down the steps and laid out on the kitchen table is in alphabet cereal is take out the garbage, mom. You're not going to look at that message and just think, oh, that was just a random message that appeared there. It's clearly an intelligent purpose that was laid out, that it was not just randomly somebody knocked over the alphabet cereal. There's an intention behind that. There's a design behind that. And so the same sort of way, we're looking at things that are much more complicated than just writing out, take out the garbage, mom, and understanding, hey, if that needs a designer, then the universe needs a designer even more so. So this is, again, we're going to jump to another one of William Craig's video to kind of have him explain this really clearly.
From galaxies and stars down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would again be life prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely. What is the best explanation for this astounding phenomenon? There are 3 live options. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Which of these options is the most plausible? According to this alternative, the universe must be life-permitting. The precise values of these constants and quantities could not be otherwise. But is this plausible? Is a life-prohibiting universe impossible? Far from it. It's not only possible, it's far more likely than a life-permitting universe. The constants and quantities are determined by the laws of nature. There's no reason or evidence to suggest that fine-tuning is necessary. How about chance? Did we just get really, 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 really lucky? No. The probabilities involved are so ridiculously remote as to put the fine-tuning well beyond the reach of chance. So, in an effort to keep this option alive, some have gone beyond empirical science and opted for a more speculative approach, known as the multiverse. They imagine a universe generator that cranks out such a vast number of universes that odds are life-permitting universes will eventually pop out. However, there's no scientific evidence for the existence of this multiverse. It cannot be detected, observed, measured, or proved. And the universe generator itself would require an enormous amount of fine-tuning. Furthermore, small patches of order are far more probable than big ones. So the most probable observable universe would be a small one, inhabited by a single, simple observer. But what we actually observe is the very thing that we should least expect: a vast, spectacularly complex, highly ordered universe, inhabited by billions of other observers. So even if the multiverse existed, which is a moot point, it wouldn't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. Given the implausibility of physical necessity or chance, the best explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned for life may very well be it was designed that way. A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a superintellect monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge.
All right. So just from that, any questions or thoughts? So I'm going to try to explain this a little bit more thoroughly looking at the different design. But like I said, part of what is really interesting, when we look at biology and look at the arguments for design, looking at biology, a lot of times you'll have guys like Richard Dawkins and others that'll say, well, we could explain how the design appears to be there, but it's really not designed because we're going to say evolution somehow created it. When it comes to physics and astronomy, there's really not that same sort of thing going on. Science hasn't come up with any sort of explanation of why we would have and expect to have what appears to be this fine-tuning and design within the universe when it comes to astronomy. And so that's why I think it's really good when we're talking with people to focus a little bit more on this astronomy aspect of it than it is to talk about the biological aspects. We'll still talk about some of those things as well, and why there's arguments and reasons that we could question really whether evolution can explain the design. But I think that's something that we don't necessarily have to go to. And I think one of our best strategies is always to just go with the argument that's going to be most convincing when we're talking with people. So a lot of this is basically looking at what we would call the Goldilocks zone. When we're talking about space, when we're talking about the universe, we're looking out and we're seeing, just like with Goldilocks, all of these different factors of, hey, if this thing is too big or too small, then life can't exist. Or if it's too hot or too cold, then life can't exist. or if it's too close or too far, life can't exist. All of these different things, it's that whole Goldilocks idea of like the chair's too small or it's too big, but the middle one's just right. That's how the Goldilocks story goes. And so the Goldilocks zone is something that astronomers themselves are going to refer to. This is something that they're going to be familiar with. And so we're going to look at all sorts of different things. So for instance, our galaxy type is a simple thing. So we exist in what's called a spiral galaxy. So you can see that basically what's happening is our universe is, our galaxy is spinning around and it's creating these kind of spirals, and it's a disc shape that the Milky Way galaxy is. That's why if you're ever up in the mountains or somewhere that's really far away, you can see kind of this faint, brighter line going across the sky because you're seeing the line of the Milky Way galaxy that we're in the middle of. If we were in a different type of galaxy, it would all just appear the same amount of brightness. But since we're in a disc-shaped spiral galaxy, that's what we see. And what's interesting is when we understand the different science between all the different galaxies, that type of galaxy is necessary for life to exist on Earth. Any other galaxy, we wouldn't be able to sustain life. And so that itself is necessary to sustain life. Also, our position in the galaxy ends up being really important. So us being about here, as far as our distance from the center of the galaxy, is important. If we were too close in, there's too much going on, we would have things that are hitting our planet and would just destroy all life. But if we were too far out, we wouldn't be able to get certain elements and certain things that actually allow life to exist. We wouldn't have some of the central things that are needed to sustain life. And so where we are even positioned in this galaxy is still necessary for life to exist on our planet. Our parent star type. So the type of star, you would think in some ways that, hey, if it's a brighter star or a bigger star, well, you adjust the distance that we are from that star, and that would allow for life to exist based upon the size of that star. But actually, physicists agree that it's not just simply that. You need to actually have a certain type of star, and that's just the length of the star has been around, how sustainable and consistent that light is, where there's different stars that are going to have big fluctuations in the amount of heat and light that they're putting out based upon how old they are or that they're going to go out soon, and that doesn't allow life to exist. And so that sort of star type is also necessary for life. And I'm going to go back and forth a little bit from some of my notes here that kind of talk about some of the reasons, if I can find my notes again. When we look at some of these different things, it's crazy to realize how precise these things end up having to be. So when we look at the star, let me see if I can find that. So our galaxy, the chances of our galaxy being the type of galaxy that we need to sustain life is 1 in 1,389. That's the chance that the galaxy we're in would actually be able to sustain life. Our sun, being the correct type of sun that we need to have, is 1 in the millions for that to be the type of star that we need to sustain life. And then when we look at another thing is, again, the age of the parent star. So you could have the right type of star, but if it's too young or too old, then it's also not going to be able to sustain life anywhere around the orbit of that star. Our distance from the sun. So that's obviously one we would look at, and it's very clear, like you're too far away, you're not going to be able to sustain life because it's too cold. You're too close, you're going to burn out. The rotation of the Earth. The rotation of the Earth or the orbit as well, we'll talk about both. Both of those things are necessary for the seasons or for the years or for the days. And if it was too long, you'd have too much fluctuations in temperature. If you don't have those seasons, then that doesn't allow for life to exist either. You need to have those seasons even to have life on Earth. Our distance from the moon, you understand that the tides and those sort of things are actually necessary for life. If the moon was too close, those tides would be too big, and that would cause all sorts of chaos and actually throw off the rotation of the Earth because of the tides and how big the tides are. So all of these things are pointing to the size of the moon, again, affects the tides. Seismic activity. So we think of tectonic plate movement, that's actually necessary for life to exist, because there's nutrients and there's elements and things like that that exist under the crust of Earth that if they're not recycled through the Earth continually, then you're actually not going to have what's necessary to sustain life on top of the planet. And so all of these things are lining up. One that's really interesting is Jupiter. So Jupiter acts as this kind of cosmic vacuum. So when planet-sized meteors and asteroids come into our galaxy, those are sucked up generally by Jupiter, because Jupiter is so large and its gravitational pull is so strong, it generally sucks those up. So you see those pictures of Jupiter and you see those impacts from the asteroids when they hit it. A lot of those impacts are from asteroids that are bigger than the Earth. So obviously, if those had ever hit Earth, we'd be done. It'd be over. There's no chance of sustaining life if that sort of thing came and hit us. And so planet that's sucking in things like that, but it's also further out than the planet that is actually sustaining life. So if Jupiter was closer to the sun than us, then it would just be sucking those asteroids and things into the Earth. Some of them would avoid the Earth, some of them would, on their way to Jupiter, hit us. And so its position relative to us ends up being important as well. The distance of Jupiter is important, because otherwise it's just going to suck us in. And it's also not going to be able to suck those things in before those things reach us. The quantity of sulfur. So this is one of the things a lot of times we talk about, can we populate Mars? And we might see some of the movies, the last one with, what was the one where what? Yeah, The Martian. And so he somehow plants food on Mars. Well, in order to actually do that, you would actually have to import dirt from Earth, because there's so much sulfur content in Mars that no sort of plant life could ever exist there, because the sulfur content's way too strong. And so you can't have that high of sulfur content. I think I have Jupiter down there twice. The rotation of the Earth, again, like if that is too quick, then you're not going to have enough temperature variation for things. And if it's too slow, then everything's going to freeze up or burn up. The tilt of the Earth is necessary. So all of these things, I got that covered up by these other things. There's 2 books by Hugh Ross that are really helpful. Let me even just adjust this really quick. I'll just take this picture out so you guys can see these. If you're interested to learn more about this, one of the main guys for the design argument looking at astronomy is Hugh Ross. And so he has these 2 books, The Creator and the Cosmos and Probable Planet, that talk about all of these anthropic principles and all of the ways that these point to there's no way we could sustain life on Earth. There's no way that life could exist without all of these kind of things coming together at once. Other things that he even talks about that I didn't include in the list is we know that there's a strong nuclear force that's a coupling constant that holds everything together in the particles of the nucleus of the atom. If that was a stronger force, then if the strong force were slightly weaker, multi-proton nuclei would not hold together. And then basically we would only have hydrogen in the universe. If the weak nuclear force coupling constant, which affects the major leptons form the whole class of elementary particles that do not participate in nuclear reactions. The most familiar weak interaction effect is radioactivity, in particular the beta decay of reaction. So that would also cause breakdown. The ratio of electron to proton mass also determines the characteristics and the orbits of the nuclei. A proton that is 1,836 times more massive than an electron. If the electron to proton mass ratio were slightly larger or slightly smaller, again, molecules couldn't form and life would be impossible. Even the distance that we have between the stars is necessary for life. The distance between the stars affects the orbits of planets, and even whether they can exist at all. The average distance between stars is 30 trillion miles. And that distance is necessary to sustain life on Earth. If it was too far, then the gravitational interaction among stars would destabilize planetary orbits. On the other hand, if the distance between stars were too great, then there would be insufficient concentration of heavy element debris thrown out by the supernova to produce rocky planets. So essentially, then you wouldn't have enough elements that were getting thrown out in order to produce planets in themselves. So all of these things end up being really, really important. And so if you're interested, you can kind of look up, if you go to reasons.org and look up the design compendium, I can give you guys the link for that. I'll put it in the description of the video as well. And then there's also Design and the Anthropic Principle that's also from reasons.org, which are both things from Hugh Ross that talk about all sorts of other arguments. So all of these things kind of come down to what we call anthropic principles, pointing out that the universe has to have this sort of design going on in it. So when you go to, why is that not bringing it up? Let me see if I can bring this one up that I had earlier. So when you go to that Hugh Ross, you're going to see fine tuning for life just in the universe. And he has a list of 140 different features that are necessary just when we look at the universe for the universe to sustain life. And then we see fine tuning for intelligent physical life to exist. And we see a list of 402 different reasons and different designs that are necessary. He's also got another list of the probability estimates for features requiring by various forms of life. And that's a list of 922. All of these different things are just these huge amounts of, you have to have this design in order to sustain life or to sustain the type of life that we have. And so it just makes it completely improbable to say that there's any other explanation for it. So other arguments that we might look at from design is we could talk about some of the biological arguments. So this, for instance, is bacterial flagellum, which is basically this bacteria that has a motor built within it that's just very, very basic motor. And all it is you basically kind of have a string at the end of it, and the motor spins that string around, or tail. And then through that, it's propelling the bacteria through the cell. And all of these parts, so this is kind of a breakdown of that engine, so to speak. If you took away one of those parts, the whole engine just fails. And so if you're going to argue for life and these sort of things developing, it doesn't really make sense, because none of this is going to work. None of this is going to help for the reproduction of the cell or for the design and for evolution to kind of do its thing, because it's not going to have any sort of sustainable help for that cell to live on until everything's there. So it makes no sense that that's going to result in evolution when it doesn't provide any sort of adaptive help until everything's there. And so there's no explanation of that sort of thing. DNA information is another problem when we're looking at the arguments and the things when we talk about evolution. The DNA is something that ends up being a big problem, because evolution is going to say that everything is evolved from this one-celled amoeba. So you have this one-celled amoeba, that's the first thing that ends up being life on Earth. And then everything else is evolved from that. Changes and mutations in the DNA and everything else slowly brings about more complex organisms that have higher DNA sequences and different things like that. But when we look at DNA in the one-celled amoeba that everything's supposed to come from, the amount of information contained in that one-celled amoeba is equal to 1,000 sets of Encyclopedia Britannica. 1,000 sets. So that's like believing that somehow that much information just explodes into existence. Totally chance. It'd be like believing that like some accident, some freak accident happened in a printing shop, and that printed 1,000 sets of Encyclopedia Britannica, because that's how much information would be contained in that one-celled amoeba. It just doesn't make sense. It's not probable that that would happen. And that's part of the thing that we have to talk about when we're giving this argument is we're not looking at it and saying there is no other explanation, because yeah, could that happen? Sure. It's possible, because I'm not saying it's not possible. We're looking at 1,000 sets of encyclopedia that could, there's a chance that maybe that could happen, but it's just not probable. And so when we're looking at whether God exists or not, when we're looking at the atheist case versus the Christian case, a lot of what we're trying to do is say, what makes the most sense of what we're talking about? What in the end is more likely between all the things that we're talking about? So we see DNA information, we see the irreducible complexity of various things. Another example would be a bombardier beetle. And a bombardier beetle basically just has these two chemicals within it. And when it releases those at the same time, those chemicals combined at the same time. And it's almost kind of like when you do Diet Coke and Mentos together and it explodes. Only this creates like an acidic thing and a really hot material. So that's why when something attacks a bombardier beetle, it releases these things, it sprays it with this acidic substance that when it combines together, and that scares off anything that's trying to attack it. But that doesn't make sense for that sort of thing to evolve, because then you have two chemicals that are extremely problematic if they're ever combined. And so evolution wouldn't really allow, and it wouldn't really make sense that somehow, well, it got one chemical in it and then it got the other chemical in it, and then it slowly evolved, somehow releasing those just at the right time to avoid killing itself. It has to really get everything in there all at once for that whole process to really work. Otherwise, it's not going to help the species survive. It's going to hurt the species survival. And if it hurts the species survival, then it's not going to keep reproducing, and it's not going to go along in the evolutionary process to really manufacture that whole mechanism altogether. So evolution, again, can't kind of explain that as well. The precision of the Big Bang itself. Last week, we talked about the argument just from life, or not life starting, but from the universe coming into existence at all. And one of the things that we talked about briefly was a lot of the things that come about through the Big Bang had to be really precise in the way it happened. The expansion rate, if it was too quickly, wouldn't allow for anything to come and form together. Even atoms themselves wouldn't form together if it was too quick. If it was too short, or if it was too slow, then everything would just collapse upon itself. So even the beginning of the universe itself requires this really precise fine-tuning. That's why the video, when it talked about the multiverse and the idea of the multiverse, what that's trying to say is, well, what if we just had thousands and thousands of universes, or endless amounts of universes? But even for universes to come into existence at all requires a huge amount of design. And so to postulate that maybe there's a multiverse creator, or creating mechanism itself, or instrument itself, that thing would also have to be really fine-tuned to create universes, because creation of universes itself, even if they don't sustain life, require a lot of fine-tuning, even if it's a small universe. So all of that to say, when we're talking about the argument from design, part of what we're pointing out to them is, yes, we could look at it and say, the chances of these proteins forming to create life, this is the chance, 1 in that huge number. That's what's, is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. But when it's the same idea of, like, if you guys remember Dumb and Dumber, the movie where he's like, hey, what kind of chance do I have with you? And she's like, I'd say like 1 in a million. And he's just like, so you're saying there's a chance? Yes, we're saying there's a chance, but that doesn't mean it's reasonable to believe that. And so we're not talking about, is there a chance? If we're going to be reasonable, if we're going to be educated in anything, if we're going to be scientific in anything, we're going to look at it and say, what's the best explanation of this? And it's not that all of these things just randomly came about. And so that all just doesn't add up. And another thing that's interesting is even just beyond, all right, can these things come about by chance? What's even crazier going beyond that is, wow, okay, that's really cool that for the universe to come into existence, all of this requires that amount of design. Or for us to sustain life, it requires all of this amount of design. But we can also see that even just for us to observe the universe, the way we're able to observe the universe, that requires even another level of design beyond what we already have established for universe to come into existence and for life to come into existence. And so not only have we got a universe that's highly unlikely just to sustain life, that's highly unlikely to exist at all, we have on top of that a universe that's like, yeah, and where you are in this universe also puts you in a very unique spot to observe the universe and to even figure out all of these anthropic principles and things that we understand. So when we go back, like think again, when we looked at the Milky Way galaxy and we thought of how it's on this disc shape and it has those spiral arms, well, if we were really close to the center, when we looked out, everything would just be too bright. We wouldn't really be able to observe anything because everything would be too bright. If we were further out, everything would be too dark. So where we are, where we're positioned on that spiral arm, and even where we are in our galaxy itself, or in our solar system itself, allows us to look out and see the universe. So our distance from the spiral arms, our distance from the moon to the sun is perfect for an eclipse. So that and our ability to see an eclipse actually allows us to observe a lot of things that we could never figure out without having that little eclipse that happens every now and then. So the eclipse is necessary to observe certain things. We don't need that to sustain life. We don't need that for the universe to exist. But in order to observe certain things, that eclipse would be necessary. So odd that we happen to live in a solar system on a planet that our moon is just the right distance from the sun, that it just barely covers up the sun and allows us to observe things that we would never be able to observe otherwise. We don't have any bright stars or planets near us. If it was too bright, it's like the same idea of when you're in a big city, you look out in a big city with all the lights, you're not going to see any stars. It'd be the same thing if we had the moon that was too close to us or the sun that was too close to us. Even gaseous nebulas. So this isn't all of this that just looks like dust. That's actually like neutrons and all these other particles and other things that are out in space. And if we were close to one of these things, we still couldn't observe anything. So even our position being away from gaseous nebula is something that's necessary for us to observe the universe. And then we also just don't have any bright other galaxies near us. The Milky Way is positioned far enough away from other galaxies that we don't have some galaxy that's so bright that we can't even see. So all of these things, not only do we have a universe that allows for the universe to exist, everything is precisely tuned that planets and other things can't exist. We have a universe that's so precisely tuned and then we're positioned that allows life to exist. And now we have a universe that's so precisely tuned and our planets so put in the right spot that we can observe the universe. All of these discoveries that we've made to know and understand those things wouldn't be possible if we weren't where we are. So all of that kind of goes to kind of pointing out some of these different quotes that we have from some different mathematicians and astronomers and physicians, not physicians. What is the word I'm looking for? Physicists, that one. So you have Freeman Dyson, and he says, the more I examine the universe and the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe is in some sense must have known we were coming. So he's looking at it and he's saying, it just doesn't, it seems like this is all precisely tuned. So of course, then we get a little bit of the question of, well, what about the multiverse? So you have Spider-Man into the multiverse. Is there just a possibility that there's all sorts of universes out there and we just happen to be the one that sustains life and allows us to observe the universe? So here are the problems with this idea. Is one, design would still be needed to explain why these universes exist because we understand the universes themselves require a lot of design and precision. And so we'd have to explain how there's all of these universes. In fact, it only makes it harder to understand why we would have all of these universes that have come into existence. One, it's unbelievable enough. But now to say that there's multiple universes that have come into existence, that only really increases the unlikelihood that we would have that sort of thing going on. So it really doesn't help the case. In some ways, it multiplies it. What's interesting, and this doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong, but what's interesting when we postulate this, the idea of multiverses is something that only when we started to see all of the evidence for things with the anthropic principle, for the universe existing, for sustained life, for observation, it's only when we started to see all of those things that the atheists started to throw out, well, what if there's just multi-universes? What if there's tons of universes out there? Doesn't mean they're wrong, but it is something to kind of keep in mind. Space-time theorems, aka space and time, are codependent. We talked about this last week. Space, time, and matter are all codependent according to how we understand it in science. And so all of those things seem to point to, well, if there's multiverses, then you're saying that space, time, and matter have come into existence earlier. And it seems all of those things would need to come, all of these universes would need to come into existence at the same time, which again, seems to multiply the problem. Another problem is this really just explains too much, because ultimately, if that's true, if there's multiverses, you can just say, well, we just happen to be in the one that allows us to sustain life or allows us to observe the universe. Well, we could say that about anything. Maybe there's a universe out there where there's a tree and that tree sheds bark that are like perfectly 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper. And when those 8.5, 11 pieces of paper fall off the tree, sometimes they land on this grass, and this grass emits this ink-like substance that looks just like what we think of with printer ink. And in that universe, some of these pieces of paper landed on that grass just right to create words. And all of those words eventually, time after time, in universe after universe, one of these universes created one that wrote The Whole Origin of Species by Charles Darwin on a book and binded it together by other animals that walked around. It's possible because we have an infinite amount of universes. So what ends up happening is, yes, could that explain how we're in a universe that has all of these sort of things, these what seem to make life improbable or observable universe improbable? Yes, the multiverse could explain that, but it also could explain something ridiculous like that. So it ends up in some ways proving too much. You need to have an argument, and this multiplies the just complexity of different things. And so we would look at it as well as and just say, Occam's razor would just say we should look at what is the most simple explanation of the data and the things that we're looking at. And when we look at the multiverse, really what that's doing is just making things more complicated. And then another thing is design is seen in all sizes, scales, all levels of accessible details. This would include the multiverse. So the design, the multiverse itself would need to have that design. The smaller universes that it creates would need to have that design. The universe maker would need to have that design. So you still create something that has all of this violates the laws of cause and effect. That's another problem with it, is because generally we look at it and we say anything that's been created or anything that exists ultimately has to have generally something that is more complicated than the thing it's creating. That's just generally how we understand philosophically or scientifically how things come into being. And postulating a multiverse goes against that common intuition and that philosophical understanding. So those end up being some of the problems with a multiverse idea. A bottom-up approach to cosmology either requires one to postulate an initial state of the universe that is carefully fine-tuned as if prescribed by an outside agency, or it requires one to invoke the notion of an eternal inflation, a mighty speculative notion to the generation of many different universes, which prevents one from predicting what a typical observer would see. So this is all to kind of point out, it just doesn't make sense for the multiverse, yet this is Stephen Hawking who's even saying this. So all of that to say, we have just really good reasons to believe that the universe itself has been designed, that it didn't just come out of nowhere. So I'm going to pull up one last thing. I wasn't sure if I'd have time for it. I want to just touch on really quick evolution, just because this is something that usually people are going to bring up when we're in conversation about stuff like this. Let's see. We'll skip over this. So evolution, one of the things with that is it's as far as the biology. Like I said, we didn't focus on the biology as much. There's plenty of arguments from biology, whether we're just talking about the one-celled organism or through mechanisms that seem like there's no way it could come and be produced through an evolutionary process. First of all, when we're talking about evolution, we need to make a distinction between micro versus macro evolution. So microevolution is change within a species. So here you see these are the crane or the canaries that the finch from the I'm just blanking it. Galapagos finches. There, I have it on. Galapagos finch that Charles Darwin said this is proof of evolution. And really what we understand is these are all the same species. And what's happening is they have these different beaks based upon what food they're able to get along the islands or what time of year it is and that sort of thing. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's changing from one species to another. Macroevolution would be saying that it's now changing it's not just a different type of finch. Now it's not a finch altogether, or maybe now it's not even a bird. And that sort of thing we don't really have as much evidence of. We really don't have any evidence of. So it's postulating because there's some sort of changes going on that there must be a possibility that it could change completely. And this happens to have a lot of problems. So macroevolution is changing from one species to another. This has never been observed. It's never been recorded. And a lot of the arguments that people end up making is, first of all, they'll look at these finches, but with that, we don't know that they've actually changed. What we have is we have multiple types of finches on these islands, and that allows them to eat different foods. So a smaller beak allows it to reach into a small flower and pull the food out of that, where a big fat beak allows it to crunch a nut and get the food out of that. So different things allow it to survive, but that doesn't mean it's changed necessarily. What we could have is actually different types within the species itself that are able to survive in different things. And so that's different than it actually changing. So some of what people are going to argue is homology, and they're looking at it and saying, see, different things have a same sort of basic structure to them. And because they have a same basic structure, it must have evolved and changed over centuries. And billions and billions of years. But we look at, here's a Corvette, right? Here is a bunch of different models of a Corvette. We wouldn't look at that and say, well, this was clearly the first Corvette, and now this is the most recent Corvette. They must have evolved. No, another explanation of that is you have a common designer, and the designer looks at it and says, hey, I've figured out a design that works. I'm just going to tweak it a little bit for each species. And because I can tweak it a little bit, I can just make a whole bunch of variety by just changing a little bit here and there. That's why you have a whole bunch of different designs. They're all similar. They're all ways that we can look at that and say, yeah, that seems to be the same sort of thing. So just because then we can look at the same sort of thing within different species. So you're looking at a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat, and you're looking at the arm and you're saying, see, look, it has the same basic bone structure, but like, the whale has really long fingers, essentially, finger bones within it. And the cat has really small ones. But it's all the same basic structure. Yes, saying that it's evolved could explain it, but also just having a similar designer could explain it. So that doesn't necessarily mean, that doesn't prove evolution. And this is what a lot of times evolutionists are going to point to, is saying, see, it has similar things. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they evolved. There's other explanations that also could explain with that. The problems with naturalism is the information contained in the single amoeba that life began from. So we talked about a single-celled organism that all of life was supposed to evolve from is equal to 1,000 sets of encyclopedia, that amount of information. And so it doesn't make sense that that just evolved. It wouldn't evolve, because if it doesn't have all that information, it doesn't come into existence. It doesn't come to life at all. And so it can't be a slow process. We also see the Cambrian explosion. This is a point at which we have almost like no species whatsoever. And then in the fossil record, suddenly we have everything, nearly everything. And with the amount of time that evolution needs in order to bring about all of these different species and different life, that just doesn't make sense. It needs to happen in a slow process. So ultimately what we see is evolution. What it would postulate is you have kind of this tree where it starts off, you have the single-celled amoeba, and then there's a two-celled amoeba that looks this way, and another two-celled amoeba that looks that way, and then three-celled amoebas, and it just creates a whole bunch of different trees. But instead, what we actually see when we look through the fossil record isn't that. What we see is there's all of the different types and species and everything that we have, and they're just dying off. And so the tree is just getting smaller. The amount of species that we have is just getting smaller. And so ultimately, that doesn't make sense, and it can't explain the complexity. Also, we don't really have any way to simulate the evolutionary process. So in order to prove anything scientifically, to a certain extent, we need to be able to produce it. We need to be able to observe it and show it. And in all the tests that people have done to try to bring that about, some of the most successful ones, there's this huge amount of manipulation going on. So one example was some bees that they messed with, and they went from having one set of wings, to now having two sets of wings. And that seems like, okay, two sets of wings, one set of wing, seems like that'd be an advantage. But what they found is that actually didn't help the species survive, because it would have taken a longer process to develop the ability to actually fly well. With the extra set of wings, they actually were having more trouble flying than the bees that only had one set of wings. So naturally, when reproduction needed to happen, the females didn't want to reproduce with the males that have an extra set of wings, because they're not surviving well. And so that mutation that could have maybe eventually been helpful, but was hurtful at first, just weeded out what could have been an evolutionary help in the species. And so that didn't actually, there's no way for that process to happen. Not to mention, even in that, you have a designer messing with the DNA in order to bring out that evolutionary process together in the first place. So even if they were able to do it successfully, what that would only prove is you need a designer in order to move the evolutionary process forward. And so ultimately, we have no lab evidence of anything like that ever coming about. We already talked about the DNA contained within it. And so all of those end up being problems with it. Another thing with naturalism, this is kind of giving a little off topic, but we'll just kind of finish with this. Naturalism is the belief that really there isn't any being out there, that everything we have is just natural, and that there isn't anything beyond science that we can know and understand. But science itself can't explain the laws of logic. Science itself is dependent upon the laws of logic to do what it does. It's dependent upon the laws of mathematics to do what it does. Science cannot do those things, cannot do what it does without that. The law of causality, the reliability of the senses, and our ability to reason and information itself, or beauty, or morality, all of those things are things that science can't speak into. So a lot of times people that you're talking with that are going to want to throw out the idea of evolution are going to fit under this kind of naturalism view, which is kind of a scientism or almost a religion around science, to say science can explain everything. But all of these things that we've listed here, science can't explain. Science might use these things, but science assumes these things in order to do what it does. There's no test that I can do to prove the laws of logic. There's no scientific test that I can do. I have to assume the laws of logic to do science. And so all of those sort of things are other things that we just know naturalism just doesn't add up. So any questions that you guys have? I don't know if it'll show, Liam, if people are like asking questions on there or even on it. Okay. I wonder if I could see. We'll just look at it later. But couple of people on here. Oh, really? They give a time limit? Look at that timing. That was like design timing, guys. Nope, that was chance. That was total chance. Or was it? Maybe I was predestined.
Yes.
All right. Perfect. I'm just going to leave it there at the right time. Cool.